SOC.
They're coming. Now we'll see these Russians deal with a crack SS division.
Hans?
Have courage, my friend.
Yeah. Hans, I've just noticed something.
These communists are all cowards.
Have you looked at our caps recently?
Our caps?
The badges on our caps. Have you looked at them?
What? No. A bit?
They've got skulls on them. Have you noticed that our caps have actually got little pictures of skulls on them?
I don't,
Hans, are we the baddies?
Let's see. We should be able to hold them at this point here, at least for a few hours.
Why skulls, though? What? Why skulls?
Well, maybe they're the skulls of our enemies.
Maybe. But is that how it comes across? I mean, it doesn't say next to the skull, you know, yeah, we killed him, but trust us, this guy was horrid.
Well, no, but...
I mean, what does skulls make you think of? Death, cannibals, beheading, pirates.
Pirates are fun.
I didn't say we weren't fun, but fun or not, pirates are still the baddies. I just can't think of anything good about a skull.
What about pure Aryan skull shape?
Even that is more usually depicted with the skin still on. Whereas the Allies...
No, you haven't been listening to Allied propaganda. Of course they're going to say we're the bad guys.
But they didn't get to design our uniforms. And their symbols are all, you know, quite nice. Stars, stripes, lions, sickles.
What's so good about a sickle?
Well, nothing. And obviously, if there's one thing we've learned in the last 1,000 miles of retreat, is that Russian agriculture is in dire need of mechanization.
Tell me about it.
But you've got to say, it's better than a skull. I mean, I really can't think of anything worse as a symbol than a skull.
A rat's anus?
Yeah, and if we were fighting an army marching under the banner of a rat's anus, I'd probably be a lot less worried, Hans.
Okay. So...
All right, everyone. Thank you for your patience in terms of working with me here. Had some technical issues and it was not recording. But anyway. So anyway, I'm just recovering from some long COVID that I've had for 2.5 years. Sometimes it hits me hard and knocks me down for a couple days. But I am well enough to at least record a lecture, so, and I hope to be well enough this week to come back to classes and next week as well. So, just to say, you know, next week is the first exam. The study guide will be posted this evening. It will primarily cover definitions as well as some of the perspectives on the civilization state, such as coming from Lind, Coker, also Acharya, who's critical of the civilizational state, so kind of know some of that, the civilizational myths. You'll see it, and then we'll kind of go over it on Monday. In terms of the multiple, it will be 50 questions, multiple choice, some from lecture, some from the readings. For chapter 5, the civilizational state, where, you know, Coker finally gets to, you know, focusing on that for a whole chapter, there won't be any questions about the parts about China or India, but there will be about Russia, because we'll be covering Russia. But just still read the stuff about China and India, because that's kind of where we're going to be headed next. Okay, so just wanted to make that clear. Anyway, just contact me if you have any questions. So today we are moving right along. So what is Russia exactly right now? Even before this conflict, Timothy Snyder, an expert on Russia at Yale, has argued that Russia is a fascist state. It's basically become that way under Putin. The sociologist Marlene Laruella, who is a French sociologist and does a lot of research on Russia, she argues that it's not, that there are other better terms to describe it. And I'll get to those probably, well, almost definitely in lecture on Monday. So first of all, though, what is fascism? I think it's important to kind of talk about that, especially as we're getting, more into ideas about civilizations. First of all, nationalism is a big part of it, but not just like patriotism, a nationalism in sense of like a rebirth of the nation. Statism, so a worship of power. There is some factionalism that is tolerated. And transcendence, where rising above workers and capitalism, that conflict, the class struggle, rising above Marxism, essentially. So Marxists in general are basically internationalist, globalist, if you want to think of it like that. And in the interwar period when fascism was developed, it was a reaction to Marxism and socialism in some ways, a way of returning to the nation, the people, etc., as opposed to a global system. Cleansing, as we talked about, ethnic cleansing, political cleansing, and so on. And then 5, I think this one is pretty important, that's paramilitarism. Militias that are sort of develop on their own, but are sometimes tolerated by fascist governments, or they may make up the beginnings of a fascist movement. And then some would argue that imperialism is another part of fascism, wanting to expand borders and so on. Others say a country can be fascistic without invading other countries, without trying to expand. So that's kind of one of the debates there. But those are kind of the main, some of the main things we sociologists look for when we're studying fascism. So one thing to keep in mind as we talk about Russia and we talk about China, we have to recognize that their systems may seem different or chaotic or whatever than the ones we have in the United States. However, we have to remember that around the world, the U.S. is looking very unstable, and the world has basically relied on American stability, even the foes of the United States as well. But political violence, mass shootings, all of these things have really questioned the American model and liberalism in sense of hyper-individualism, you could say neoliberalism. So the Russian theorist Konstantin Krylov, kind of liberal, conservative nationalist, was already asking in the 1990s, does liberalism hold within it the seeds of its own destruction? And he is someone I'll talk about on Monday. When we look at the U.S. right now, we have to understand that these images that we see, point to, paramilitarism. You can see a lot of things that show a nascent, if not already emergent, fascist movement in the United States. And, the Capitol being overrun, this guy in the whatever fur hat that is, and horns, sitting, where senior government officials sit, and president being arrested, and so on. It looks like a fascist movement to a lot of people around the world. The Proud Boys, Western chauvinists, how much they know about the West is actually questionable, but it's a movement, and it shows an instability within our system, and we have to keep that in mind as we look at other systems. And we have to also understand the overlap between certain movements in the United States and in Russia, as well as the rest of the world. One group, the Base, which has these skull masks. They're basically a neo-Nazi group, and the leader, Nazaro, has been in Russia for a number of years. And back a few years ago, someone took a picture of him with a T-shirt that had a picture of Putin on it, saying "Russia, absolute power." So when we do start to look at Russia and Russia's history, and especially the current situation, we have to remember that Russia has a long, in many ways, tragic history. In the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as it's called there, they had 27 million people killed, which is higher than any country in any war in history. So that's pretty incredible. And many cities were destroyed in the process. It's much more complex, and talk about that a little bit more on Monday, and how that plays into how Russia sees itself and the world, and so on. One figure that's sort of mentioned by Coker in his book is the historian, philosopher, conservative nationalist Oswald Spengler. And he basically argued that civilizations have like some core essence, and they go through different seasons, so to speak. And there's different types of societies, and he wrote 2 volumes called The Decline of the West, and they're very interesting. They're highly inaccurate, though. They're very sweeping in their generalizations. They don't always quite connect. I think Coker in the Civilization State book says, there's less and less returns when you read it, as we actually learn more and more about real history, archaeology, evolution, and so on. But he believed that the West was declining, but not for reasons that people think about today. He takes it back to like ancient Greece and just the nature of Western rationalism and so on, that's leading to its own decline. He would probably approve of the civilizational state concept. In fact, he would probably be overly excited about it, I guess. Another figure who has very much influenced by Russia and written about it, Isaiah Berlin. He was a social theorist, originally from Latvia. When he was young, saw the Russian Revolution. He saw police beaten by a mob and probably killed, and it had a big impact on him. And he went to England to help with the war effort against the Nazis, was involved in, helping Jewish organizations. He was Jewish himself. One of the things that he also did, though, was he investigated a number of Russian thinkers, read their works and so on, stuff that nobody in the West was really doing, that everyone was kind of believing there was this inevitable trend toward the end of history, toward liberalism. And Berlin said that Russian thinkers have a different view of the world, that basically they're often thinking about what their purpose is, and, the inability to reach perfection, moral perfection, and so on. And then that it's, there's little progress. You continually see cycles of sort of, despair and tragedy throughout Russian history. And Berlin kind of used that, and others have pointed to that, saying, how can we talk about progress when we've seen so much pain and suffering and so on. So Berlin also comes up with an idea that's important for the sovereign internationalism, and that's value pluralism, which is basically that there are a wide range of values which all may be correct but may contradict each other. So you may want to reduce pollution and save the environment and so on, but nevertheless go on a plane trip or a cruise or just drive a car or whatever it might be. And there are all sorts of things like that. And also just different types of religion and different views on gender, on how life should be lived and so on. So Berlin said that basically this is something that we can't get away from. It's always going to be there. And I think it's a compelling and probably, I think quite a fairly accurate view. And then it's, how do we come together? That's the challenge. So looking at Russia and its history, if you remember when if you remember, Europe, Catholic Church has the Reformation, which challenges it, and you have the rise of Protestantism, and the Renaissance and religious wars, all this, which creates Thomas Hobbes and all these different ways of thinking about the world. The Orthodox Church never really went through that process. Pertaining to Russia as well as Eastern Europe in general. So you didn't see as many alliances, so centralized control in Russia was fairly easy. Although controlling the peasants during the plague was very difficult, but nevertheless that whole area has been sort of a battleground for a long time. Eastern Europe and Central Asia and so on. Lots of armies going back and forth and so on. And it's affected their development as the Eastern Orthodoxy in Europe, going, a lot of Eastern Europe going from Greece all the way up to Russia, essentially. So another interesting thing in Russia, I'm going to go kind of quickly, so my apologies. So the merchants didn't play a big role. That's different than what we see in England or France and so on. The peasants were put into a situation of serfdom, which is almost like slavery, where they're basically owned by certain nobles and so on. I should have put in a slide that I missed. Before Catherine the Great, there was Peter the Great, not her husband. Peter the Great was her husband's father, and he did a lot to to bring European culture into Russia. Various different ideas, philosophies, the Enlightenment ideas, clothing, whole range of things like this, and he wanted Russia to be essentially more of a European power. Catherine II, she staged a coup. Her husband Peter was killed a few days later. There's a comedy show about it called The Great, which not very accurate historically, but interesting anyway. So Catherine the Great, she expanded Russia as well, conquered Crimea as well as expanded elsewhere, and also brought more Enlightenment ideas into Russia, which led it to develop a sort of unique culture and civilization, you could say. So most of the serfs were owned by the state. The nobles could move them or sell them. As I said, in the 1700s, there was no alliances or anything, you start to see a state really coming together and centralizing. Peasants were the main population in Russia. Most of the army was peasants. They were freed from being serfs in 1861, but they were kind of stuck to the land, similar to African Americans who were slaves. But then when slavery ended, they were still, sharecroppers and so on. And so the peasants in Russia had it worse. The situation was worse in 1916 than it was in France during their, French Revolution. So pretty clear that something was going to change. And Russia, like I said, started to develop its own unique culture. Tolstoy was an intellectual, an aristocrat, really conservative, but he did some, incredible works that have been described as the best in history. War and Peace. You should watch the video War and Peace. I'd play it if I had more time, but it shows he wanted to write about a book about the Decembrists, which were a group that wanted to overthrow the Tsar, a revolutionary group in the mid-1800s. But to understand them, you had to go back to, 1823, and there was some war, and then you had to go back to when Napoleon came. But to understand that, you had to go back to, so it ends up going pretty much further back, and there are like 580 characters. Napoleon comes in a few times here and there. Never even makes it to the Decembrists, which were the original group that he wanted to write the book about. But anyway, it's a very interesting way in which he developed the story. Probably more popular, I would say, is Dostoevsky. Oops, not me. So Dostoevsky is, one of the most famous writers. He was a monarchist, but he was also anti-authoritarian at times, unjust authority. So he wrote about crime and punishment, one of his most famous books. He basically believed in a pan-Slavic ideology. The Slavs are an ethnic group in Eastern Europe and parts of Russia. He was sent into exile in Siberia for being part of the Petrevsky Circle, which was an anti-Tsarist group. And he was sent there for a while, wrote a book called Notes on the Underground. One of my favorite books that he's written is Demons, about some revolutionaries. But a lot of his themes are critiques of nihilism, morality, violence, and so on. Nihilism is the rejection of all religious and moral principles, basically the belief that life is meaningless. So nihilism has grown in the last 100, 200 years. people attribute it to Nietzsche, but it's, Nietzsche actually spoke against it, was opposed to nihilism, as was Dostoevsky. Both of them were fairly despairing, were opposed to the kind of emptiness of modern life. Nietzsche, wanted the strong Übermensch, powerful, warrior spirit in people to rise above nihilistic attitudes. Dostoevsky, being an Orthodox Christian, saw that as the anchor to have sort of meaning and morality and so on. But both of them recognized that they were sort of seeing a nihilistic age, and kudos to those who get that reference there. Another figure who's not as well known and translated is Konstantin Leontief. He was a monarchist, novelist, essayist, doctor, and diplomat. He wrote about a number of things. He was kind of like Nietzsche, also saw a lot of nihilism, and like Dostoevsky, he anchored his beliefs in sort of a mystic Christianity, and he actually went to a mountain in Greece and lived in a monastery for a while. So he was in some ways like Nietzsche, but religious. He predicted that there would be major wars in Europe, and that Russia would have trouble balancing its size, essentially, between Asia and Europe, and that monarchies would fall. And he strongly believed in the Russian monarchy. He wanted the Russian Empire to go from the Bering Strait to Istanbul, which is then Constantinople. He only wrote one non-fiction, Byzantinism and Slavdom, where he kind of laid out his ideas of how the Ottoman Byzantine culture of Constantinople would merge with the Slavic culture of Eastern Europe and Russia. Russia had a number of major thinkers and influencers at this time. Bakunin was a major proponent of anarchism and basically believed you could develop a society that was free from central government and base it on community and self-governing communities and so on. He had a number of debates and arguments with Marx and other communists. He felt that the state could be too easily used for repression. Marx and others said, without the state, you don't really have anything to protect workers from, predatory capitalists who may have their own militias or something like that. So, they had sort of a divide there. The anarchist movement was often peaceful, but there were certainly violent elements as well. There were a number of monarchs that were assassinated in Europe, bombings, and President McKinley in the United States was assassinated, and so on. Another anarchist that came along in Russia was Peter Kropotkin, and at this point in the West, Herbert Spencer's idea of the survival of the fittest and social Darwinism, was basically saying competition is the key, is the main evolutionary mechanism, essentially. And he saw white males as being the superior race and so on. Kropotkin was actually a zoologist and knew more about nature than Spencer did, and said that actually you could look at Darwin and find that evolution requires cooperation as well, at least among certain species. And so there their biological insights in many ways are off or outdated and so on. But Kropotkin really focused more on cooperation, and a lot of social psychologists and evolutionary psychologists are as well. His famous book, Mutual Aid, is one of them. You can read this on your own. Move quickly. The Revolution of 1905. So, as we'll talk about later, Russia and Japan had a war, and it was very significant because it was the first time that a European power, in this case Russia, was defeated by a non-European power, at least for the first time in the last 100 years of that period. And this happened while Russia was, sending its resources and so on to this war that they were losing. And so you started to see massive unrest across the country. The Tsar established a multi-party system called the Duma, which is like a parliament, but it didn't really function. It was more there for ceremonial purposes. There were a lot of peaceful actions, and protesters were fired upon. And so there's all this unrest that's happening across the country. And a group forms, a paramilitary group called the Black Hundreds. And they developed before the revolution in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And we'll talk about them on Monday because they've come back. They're pro-Tsar, they're anti-Semitic, generally xenophobic. And their basic idea was that the Tsar didn't have enough support, that his police weren't going to be enough, that the Black Hundreds had to be this militia group that supported the Tsar. He allowed the Black Hundreds to be a paramilitary force, and one of the things that they did was to attack many Jewish communities. There were 700 pogroms in 1905. It's believed out of this period the Tsarist secret police wrote the conspiracy theory, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which kind of has been used by anti-Semites ever since, just saying the Jews run everything, essentially. And Norman Cohn did an analysis of it, and he also wrote that book, Millenarianism, about, the millenarian movements and so on. Well, the Black Hundreds, like I said, most of the movement came from working class peasants, people who were, upset with the modernizing, liberalizing attitudes, or opposed to the socialists or the anarchists, and so on. You also have Slavic ideologies developing and growing at this time. Not going to spend a lot of time on that, but essentially this idea that Eastern Europe and all these areas should be brought under control of the Russian Empire. The All-Slavic Union was Danilevsky, just a Slavic thinker. Believed that basically all of this should be joined into Russia, going all the way down to Greece. Rasputin, just gonna mention him because he's sort of interesting and kind of shows the draw of mysticism in Russia, and we'll talk about that in more detail on Monday as well. He just briefly he had sort of a cult-like following. The wife of the Tsar thought he had healing powers, and so he was brought in, and a number of aristocrats thought he was having too much of an influence on the family, and so he was assassinated. The Russian Revolution, when it happened, there were two groups, basically. Those who were Bolshevik communists and those who were more nationalistic, and Kerensky was one of the more nationalistic. And in the United States, and probably across the West, actually, we don't really learn much about the Russian Civil War, but it's actually quite interesting. So you have the Tsar abdicates, and then you have the communists, the Reds, fighting the Whites, the anti-communists, which were basically a bunch of nationalists, but also, people that were fascists, and the Black Hundreds joined the Whites and all these things. The Black Hundreds was outlawed when the Bolsheviks won. So, Lenin led the communist revolution, and it comes to power, wins the Russian Civil War. The differences in the art, Russian people all with the red flags together, versus the more traditionalist Russia, where you see a knight freeing, I'm not sure, Lady Russia, and the communist flag on the ground broken and in tatters. Now, the Bolsheviks, they take power and they actually become much more oppressive than the Tsar was. So the secret police for the Tsar was about 800. In 1895, by 1916, it was 15,000 as there was more unrest. The Cheka, which was like the early KGB, in 1919 had 37,000 members, and by 1921, 250,000. And then for, 50 years, 60 years there, during the last Tsarist period, there were 14,000 executions. And then just the first 5 years of the Russian Revolution, there were 200,000 state executions. Pretty dramatic. One major figure that is exiled is Ivan Ilyin, and he's important because he's had an influence on Putin and a lot of people around him. So we shall return to him on Monday. But he basically was exiled because he was anti-capitalist, and Lenin thought, it's good to have an anti-capitalist out there, even if he's opposed to the Soviet Union. But he was more in favor of Nazism and fascism, and as I said, we'll return to him and his relevance for today. Eurasianism. This is an ideology that develops in the 1920s. It's imperialistic, it's anti-Western, it's trying to figure out how to merge the Asian and European parts of Russia together. It kind of sort of dies off for a while during the period of the Soviet Union, but comes back in the 1990s and is mostly marginal today, but is popular amongst powerful people in Russia. So the Soviet Bolshevism is a good example of a millenarian movement. Basically, the Tsar is overthrown, and basically everyone thought the world would change, this Russian Revolution, the workers would come together and so on, and it kind of just does not work that way. Fantastic book about it. That's 1,000 pages. I read it when the pandemic started. Fantastic book in many ways, but I'll leave you to read it on your own. Stalin. Stalin is, takes power, basically executes all of his former allies, and massacres lots of people and engineers genocidal violence against Ukraine and so on. A lot of people think of him as kind of this dim-witted, thuggish person, but he was actually very well read. A book about his library. He read all the great works in the Enlightenment, philosophy and Russian history and theology, and he studied religion and stuff, and yet, it's an example of, you can be a very intellectual person and still do some very terrible things. He was, far more intellectual than Hitler was, and, nonetheless did a great deal of atrocities. The peasants were, slowly destroyed as part of the population, deported to new towns where factories were being built and given new work orders and sent into cities, and basically trying to break down that system. Like I said, assassinates most of the people around him, executes lots and lots and lots of people, like so much that it goes way overboard, as often happens. One early revolutionary, Nikolai Bukharin, was also a deep thinker and supported violence during the initial revolution and the Civil War, but then after it was over, wanted to, end the police state, was opposed to using state violence for revolutionary goals. He wanted to be more diplomatic and, win people over by words and, spread slogans of workers of the world and so on, but Stalin didn't like that and saw him as a threat, so he had him executed. One great book, Arthur Kessler's Darkness at Noon, is about a guy who devotes his life to communism and is then arrested for not being communist enough, and it's based on Bukharin. The main character, Rubashov, says at some point, "I went to communism as one goes to a spring of fresh water, and I left communism as one clambers out of a poisoned river strewn with the wreckage of flooded cities and the corpses of the drowned." Massive starvation in Ukraine. They were basically forced to send all their food to Moscow. Great movie about it. Mr. Jones, who goes to Moscow, and the liberal press is kind of like held up there, and they get all these, perks for just kind of giving Stalin good coverage. And no one's allowed to leave Moscow, and let alone go to Ukraine, so Mr. Jones, Gareth Jones, a reporter, goes to Ukraine and sees the famine there and how bad it actually is. A great book, Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. It's called the Holodomor. About a year, it killed a few million people, starved, put into, some people resorted to cannibalism. Pretty awful situation. When he came back, he told his story to George Orwell, who then went on and wrote Animal Farm, which is based on the Russian Revolution, and where the pigs take over the farm and start acting like the humans and work all the animals almost to death. And it's basically it's an analogy to Ukraine. And the totalitarian state that develops in Russia, gives Orwell a lot to put into his, great book, 1984, that in the Nazi state and fascism and so on. Russia, to jump ahead a ways, it has a strong military-industrial complex. Gorbachev says Glasnost, which was a period of basically bringing about greater change and being less antagonistic, and the military has not necessarily been too fond of that. Well, Russian culture, had made objects, many of which were found in the West as well, modeled after Western goods and so on, and it just, couldn't really keep up. There's no competition, so there's no sort of innovation or things like this that show the problems with central planning. Just like America, back in the 1950s, there were these very visionary ideas about the future, space, living in space, and so on and so forth. And just like the optimism of America in the 1950s in space, it just hasn't worked out that way. At the same time, you had while these posters are showing the future, you had the reality of the gulags and the Soviet prison camp, where millions and millions of people went. Many of them were innocent. The great book on this, the classic, is Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. Another major moment in the development of modern Russia, the Soviet-Afghan War, where they tried to expand essentially into Afghanistan, and America and France and China and Saudi Arabia gathered, the most violent jihadists they could find, took them to Afghanistan, gave them all sorts of weapons, training, and so on, and they, fought the Soviets for a decade, and eventually the Soviets left, and they were defeated, and America and everybody else left too, and the violent jihadists stayed and became Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and now they're back in power again after another superpower was there for about 20 years now, I guess, or almost 20 years. One thing that's relevant, especially for today, the losses in this war, which was hugely destructive for the Soviet Union. It's estimated that in this decade they've lost as many forces as has been lost in the last year in the war in Ukraine. So quite substantial what's going on over there now. Chernobyl was in Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union at that time. Nuclear disaster. It just showed, a system crumbling, mismanagement, and so on. In Chernobyl, there's a great mini-series on HBO about it. There's also a good documentary. And so you get to the 1980s and the 1990s, and you see uprisings across Eastern Europe, the breaking of the Berlin Wall, Fukuyama's writing The End of History, and Russia is, the Soviet Union falls apart and Russia becomes a different country in 1991, and Putin basically comes to power in the very late 90s and hasn't been there ever since. And we'll talk more about that on Monday. All right, have a good weekend, everyone.